Well, thanks very much. The subject matter of this discussion, it's been kind of brewing for years. From the time in 2007, 2008, when we thought about representing Rothe House to a larger public and started examining exactly what it is we could talk about, what stories we could tell in Rothe House. And we commissioned a whole series of reports to try and compile that work. And indeed, if you remember, back in 2013, we had a seminar to present what we knew at that time. And the questions were open then, and in the way of historians, you stumble across sources and you find out a little bit more, and if you're patient enough, you can finally put a few things together that make sense. So it's at that point that we arrive at today, or at least that I think I've arrived at, knowing a few things more about Rothe House. Recent prompt to put all this together is a seminar that was held in December 2018, I think it was, organised by the Department of Heritage, to look at the overlap between architecture and archaeology, to look at our upstanding medieval buildings, which are the subject of both of those disciplines, discovery and contextualization through archaeology, sometimes by digging and looking behind surfaces and so on, and the pressing need to make use of those buildings and to put them in the service of modern society and to hold on to their meanings and the evidence that they contain. So sometimes they're clashing and sometimes, and very often, those two poles can be marshalled and brought to work in the same direction. So there's a publication that's about to be launched, I think this year, by the department, and I'm hoping that the work that I've done here will be represented in that in some way. But I think it's very important to first and foremost test it where it comes from in the Kilkenny Archaeological Society and in Rothe House. And didn't mention that this was my place of work for 3 years, from 2005 to 2008. It was the offices of the Heritage Council. And I'm kind of going to start with that. 2002, 2003, the Heritage Council published a conservation plan for Rothe House. And that was meant to chart a future in which all of the heritage values of the place could be taken care of, all of the significances to be sent into the future. And one of the first things that it suggested was that the KAS form a company that is focused on the house. That was the Rothe House Trust, and that's where we are now. And I think it is worth looking beyond that and remembering just what the journey is since 1962, when the Kilkenny Archaeological Society bought this property, or parts of it, and gradually began putting the jigsaw puzzle back together again. So by the time this drawing was published by Colleen O'Driscoll in about 2011, we could talk with pride about an entire Burgage plot that was all in one ownership and presented together. But that has been quite a struggle, quite a time-consuming jigsaw puzzle put together. And the opening of the garden as a restored medieval garden is almost the crowning glory in that, not to mention what has happened with the building. So quite an amazing thing, and we almost now take it for granted that Rothe House is this thing that stretches from Parliament Street to the city walls, but it hasn't always been like that in the recent past and through much of the existence of the building. And I'm going to bring you back to a particular time when Rothe House came to the attention of historians and indeed of the people who were assessing property across the country for taxation purposes and the detailed records that they made. And there's a kind of a key moment between 1846 and I'd say 1852 that kind of casts light backwards and forwards, and I think that's an illuminating moment, and that's what I'm going to dwell on. But I'm going to quote the words of a theorist of heritage and memory called Pierre Nora, and he talked about certain places as places where a community deposits its memories. And I think that is surely resonant for Rothe House in Kilkenny. And someone who commented on this complex thing, which is memory or history, a man called Assman. He said, sometimes we're not able to establish what the past was really like, but rather how it has been used and what it has meant for particular consecutive presents. That strikes me as being true of the history of Rothe House, and I'm hoping to try and illustrate a bit of that. I'm going to give you one other quote from David Brett, and he says, history is a verb. He says, we history, like art and sport, it is not a fixed entity but an activity. From this thing, we history, we do it. It follows that history is not given but made. And I think I'll be showing a few ways in which history has been made way back then in the 1840s and 1850s. One more quote from Eddie McParland. To understand why buildings assumed the shape they did, he had to look at the people who built them, who paid for them, and who used them, and asked what were their motives and what did they think of them. He said he spent as much time looking at the documents as at the buildings themselves. And I think that, again, will hold true for what I'm about to talk about this evening. The wide-angle view first. Rothe House is situated in Kilkenny. This is the view from St. Canice's Round Tower, the top. And it's kind of nice to think about that aerial perspective as being available to citizens of Kilkenny for over 1,000 years. Now we're getting used to views like this because of drones. But this was a place where people could go and oversee their city. Just in case you're asking, here's Rothe House here. Third house, we're underneath this roof here. Again, this is not the subject of my lecture, but this is medieval fabric as well, and indeed in behind it. And when you go looking, there's a whole load of fragments of medieval Kilkenny in behind the facades of Georgian buildings and in the backlands and the back lanes, and as I'm sure many of you know. So it's a rich medieval city. We'll begin with the foundational moment for Rothe House, I think, as far as many of us are concerned, when the Reverend James Grave noticed a medieval remnant with a name that alluded to an early 19th century schoolmaster, Wolfe, who kept a school here for many years. The ground floor, the arched ground floor of the facade, alluded to a different life form, and this is quoting James Graves. The discovery of a similar row of arches existing in the street elevation of an old house in Colm Murray, erected by John Rothe and Rosa Archer, his wife. The entrance archway alone was visible until within a few days past, when the old dashing having been removed, the imposts, piers, and archstones of 4 other similar arches were exposed to view. Having taken a sketch and measurements, I am unable to supply a lithograph of the archway as it then appeared. Here we have it, our first glimpse of Rothe House as something important. Now, there are a couple of interesting things about this image, and I'll come back to it later on in the talk. We know that this was the fragment of the oriel window. It was subsequently rebuilt twice. It's interesting to imagine that he's drawing timber panelling here, because he goes on to talk about that. And one other little interesting thing, if you stand in front of Rothe House and look at the left-hand side of the archway, you can't see the inner archway and the door to the second house. So he's distorted his perspective a little bit because that connection is important to him. And indeed, as a piece of urban architecture, the sense of looking through a dark passageway to a bright space, another dark passageway to another bright space, is quite an architectural event. There's a drama to that, and I think there can be no doubt that that was part of its original architecture. Graves' description was in sharp contrast to the squalid reality reported elsewhere, as we shall see. He reported further on the interior of the building, a valuable account of timber that did not survive later restoration. He said in the internal arrangements of the house, there are no party walls used. That, as it happens, is an incredibly important observation. If we think about a Georgian building, there's a room at the front and a room at the back with a wall in the middle that supports the floors and the roof and so on. It's divided into, light comes in from 2 sides, the front and the back, and not across the party wall. And that's a key moment in the development of architectural buildings, whether urban or rural, in the 17th century and in the 18th century. So Graves's observation is capturing an essence of the medievalness of this architecture. Each floor runs the whole extent of the building, and resting as it does on massive oak beams is well calculated to support the several internal partitions, which are invariably of oak timber. Now, let's just digress there and imagine what that might be like. Some of you may have been to Tintern Abbey in County Wexford, since it has been opened as a visitor attraction, and may have seen this display of oak panelling that survived from the time of the Coakley's taking over the building in the 1570s. So this is an example of 16th century oak panelling as may have existed in Rothe House, and taking this close up with a piece of furniture to kind of give a sense of the ambience of the house, and to also remember other construction that is available, that is preserved there, which is wattle and daub partitions in timber frames of the same date. And that perhaps is a more likely form of construction that we might see. And another example, a guy called Callahan is his name, writing in the Journal of the Old Wexford Society in 1981, makes reference to Bargy, to shallow relief carved detailing of flowers and then little filled fluted cornice. Very simple, high value, high craftsmanship involved in doing something like this. And this is perhaps the type of craftsmanship that was available to John Rothe when he was building his house. I can only surmise and suggest that it might have been something like this. James Graves would like to presume that the last 2 feet above such panelling were occupied by ornamental stucco work, and he was thinking about Carrick Castle and Carrickfergus, but we don't actually have any evidence for that. And this is not evidence for what is in Rothe House, it's a suggestion. So we're already in the world of imagination and illusion. Just before Graves made his observations, this had occurred. A plan had been made in 1848 by John Mulhall, measurer. And he, in his turn, knew he was looking at something medieval because he Gothicized his script in drawing up this plan. And we think that this was prompted by the sale of the house from Preston to Willoughby, which occurred around this time. More about that in a short while now. And what's fascinating about this is that it comes at a time when Rothe House was not an easy place to be in. We have a report from the Kilkenny Journal from the 6th of June 1840. In Wolf's Arch there are 19 tenements, 66 persons, all in a state of the most distressing poverty. In this place there is one family, the father of which went to America. His children are young, 6 in number, and have no means of support. And that is not the only reference to abject poverty in Rothe House. And that was from before the famine. Through the famine years, and again we'll be looking at it shortly, Rothe House was a place where poor people lived, and Preston and his successor Willoughby permitted people to live here from week to week if they paid their rent. So a very, very fragile fingernail lives hanging on by their fingernails. So we mustn't forget that James Graves' picture of the finery of the medieval monument and bringing to the fore the name of Rothe instead of Wolf was an assertion about this place and about the past at that time. Around that time, Ireland was being surveyed top to bottom, imposed taxes. The valuation survey, it had begun in the 1820s under Richard Griffith. It was primarily meant to be about land, and through an inevitable attritional process, they said every parcel of land, then they said every big building, and then they were forced to include every small building, and then they were forced to include every building in every town. And they had to be thorough and they had to be fair, so they measured every building. And the result was Griffith's survey, which was published for Kilkenny in 1849. But preceding that, records were made, meticulous records. People were fired if they didn't take their record keeping seriously in this survey, of every single building, and as it turns out, every single part of a building that held a tenement. And this is what it looks like. This is from 1847, that's the year before Mulhall drew his plan. And this is Richard Preston, and it describes a house with a passage in it, a cellar below it, a deducted portion, and another cellar, and so on. Now, the people who put this valuation together, this survey together, were being checked and rechecked, and so a second record was made of the exact same thing. And strangely enough, it's given a later date of the 13th of November 1847, but it looks much messier, and I wonder if somewhere along the line in the National Archives these have been transposed. Well, here we see the same record as previously, and it's been reworked completely to describe the same place, but in analysed in a different way. Now, I've cleaned that up and turned it into a table like this, which we can perhaps hope to understand a little more clearly. And again, this is going to be a little clearer here in the next slide. I'll tell you what, I'll just jump straight to it. From this type of information, I've given this set of index numbers to the different parts there. They take a big block and then they carve a piece out of it and say, deduct this part. And then they say there's a cellar underneath it, and you deduct that and you add it in somewhere else. They're meticulously accountable for the space that they were describing. So it is possible to follow if you look at the length and breadth and height of the different parts. How they related to each other, and we can build up a picture of the building at this time, and it looks a bit like this. So this is the plan, and these are the various parts. That is corroborated by the map that I'm going to show you in a minute or two now, the Valuations Office map from later in the 19th century. We know these parts are right. One of the really fascinating things that comes out of this description of Rothe House in 1847 is the cellar at the front. And the cellar, the dimensions don't work. They add up to 51 feet, and that's wider than the whole thing is. In reality, I think it's only 48 or 49 feet, so someone was rummaging around in the dark with a tape measure and getting it wrong. But the critical thing is that it divided into approximately 2/3, 1/3. Not half and half. Passageways in the middle. We'll be coming back to that. And there's a little piece that is taken out of one part and added into another. And again, I wonder, is this the echo of Rose Archer's access from the 4 Street gate to the cellar, which is mentioned in John Rothe's will? So we have this little echo, glimmer, connection perhaps between measurements that were made in 1847, nothing more, and description that was made in 1619, many years before. Tentative, I know. Anyway, so this is the type of volumetry we can build up a picture of the building. And this is just a sketch. There's a nicer version coming up later. But a few crucial things that it shows. There were buildings here. This is the street front of House 1, and lower volumes below that. And House 2 is here. And there are buildings in between House 1 and House 2 on the south side of the plot. And we know from descriptions that there is, in fact, a stairway to access the first floor in this location. It's on the maps as well. So we know that this is how the first floor, the feeling room of House 1, was accessed up to about 1850. Now, moving on. A totally different place as far as the valuations officers were concerned was Wolf's Arch, and they went and measured that as well, twice. And this is how that looks. If anyone is interested in checking this or looking further, I have indexes and I have PDFs. They're all easily downloadable if you know where to look from the National Archives website. And I'd be delighted to help anyone who's doing further research on other buildings in Kilkenny. My knowledge would be a little bit woollier farther afield, but certainly if you had an inquiry it'd be easy to follow up. They're very helpful. And again, this gets revised and it turns into a table like this, of various parts. And maybe what's most interesting in the valuations record is the comments that the valuers made about the different parts. Mr. Parker lives in part of this house and has the rest let in rooms to a great number of weekly tenants, very old and in bad repair. Held from Mr. Parker by the week, common yard in front. Let by Mr. Parker to a great number of weekly tenants. This is house 3 now, we'll see, where we're sitting now. All divided by wooden partitioning into small rooms. Yard common in front. And the same here again for house offices and house shed. Now, I'm not sure whether a reference to house shed is to a house that is as fragile as a shed, or a shed that is an adjunct to a house. It may well be the latter, but if it isn't, we have people living in the most flimsy structures in the yard here between house 2 and house 3, 2 of them along the wall here, and 3 other structures in at the back here of this building. They may have been used for businesses, and there is indications and clues that, but they may also have been dwellings. Here are 2 sheds or houses, and here are 3 more sheds or houses, and here a great number of tenants divided by wooden partitions living from week to week. And one other interesting detail that emerges from this volumetric description of Rothe House is that the Outscale had a roof over only a small part, which is where the toilets are now. And so the rest was unroofed. Now, here's the proof that those parts go together, as the Valuations Office records show from later in the 19th century. All those little numbers are correlated to what is in the Valuations Office books. They shift them around at the start and then they settle down, and everything that they do is meticulous and thorough, and if something has been changed, the old version is crossed out and the new version is put in. So if you're careful and clerical, you can follow the pieces back to the very origins of the record. So we get this picture here. Another interesting thing that this shows is that there was a third address in relation to what we now consider to be the unitary Rothe House and Garden, and that was numbers 3 and 8 on Evans Lane. So there's a little bit of description about how you get into the garden at number 8 and how you have to go through, I think, the house in 2 here to get into 3. And they're described as gardens and nothing more. There are offices being built in the rearmost garden after a short while. One of the descriptions is a good, well-enclosed garden with entrance off the lane. New offices are built in the garden. So now this is a bit of a crooked drawing, but it shows how those volumes fit together with that plan for houses 1, 2 and 3. And so here's the Outscale, most of it unroofed. These are the little sheds in at the back. And then this curious thing here about the actual volumes that existed in between the Outscale and House 1 were actually very small. And in fact, they don't stretch all the way back to the Outscale, and that is proven, I think, by this map as well. Now, another thing I'm showing on this drawing, which I'll describe in a bit more detail later, is these windows, which the Valuations Office didn't document, but they exist. You can go and look at them in the Phelan room and in the Lanigan room, and indeed in the office and the reception area. And I'm going to talk about them a little more later. In the gable wall of the building, breaks all the rules that we now have and have had for centuries about a division of urban space and party walls and not being allowed to take light through party walls. But I put it on that drawing so you can see it there. Again, very, very low volumes here, and that will become important as we look at the next set of documents in this flurry of documents, as I've called it. So the Mulhall plan, I think Michael O'Dwyer, or one of the contributors over the years to the old Kilkenny Review, has pointed out that the Mulhall plan came from the Shearman papers in the Russell Library in Maynooth. So I went looking for the original and came across this. Now, I'm going to say that it was the Reverend Shearman who drew these, but I don't know. These drawings are in his papers, and I don't think anyone has looked at them before. I think they're tremendously important. They look like this. There's these 2 pages and another page full of drawings jumbled up side by side on a sheet of paper in pencil. but they do say Rothe House, Rothe's House, Colm Market, Kilkenny, and they do have a date. And I can't help but feel that the Reverend Shearman took his cue from James Graves and ventured into this tenement because it was important, and took out his sketchbook and made some tentative marks that tried to record what this place was like, but maybe was put off by being approached by a surly man or woman, and ran, having only made these very tentative sketches. I'd love to think it was like that. That actually happened to me when I stopped in a place called Mérida in Spain, and I was getting out my sketchbook and instantly drawing the wonderful vernacular, and I was approached by someone and better go. So I just feel that the Reverend John Francis Shearman, this may have happened to him here. Now, these were all put together by his perhaps follower or inheritor, the Reverend J. O'Halloran, in Ringsend in May 1885. That's where this volume came from. And these are the only drawings, the Mulhall map and these drawings are the only drawings in a whole series of papers about genealogy. Most people don't go looking for it there, but I think they're quite special. So what I did is, apart from photographing them, I traced them. And I'll show you the tracings now and maybe try to compare them to what we know about Rothe House. So I think this is a drawing of the rear of the first house. I think some people have doubted that these two windows were original, but here we have evidence that they are. Certainly this window has a very neat carving in the concrete on it that describes Louis Feely's interventions in the 1960s. But there was a window there in 1852. So there may be more fabric surviving in Rothe House than we thought, and it is clear that there is less as well. This drawing I have to put a question mark beside because I can't fully interpret it. I'm not satisfied that it is either looking north at the return to House 1 or south at a building that doesn't exist anymore. I just don't know. It's very different from what's there. We don't have a stairs. There should be a stairs there, or maybe it's gone at this stage. But this arch here, I'd love to think that this was house the return and that this was part of the rear facade, but there are things that are missing if we look at that. So tentative sketches, open to interpretation, views welcome, differing views welcome. And then we have this drawing of the second house, 2 stories high, and this is very clearly the big passageway and the entrance door to the house. And we'll go on, and this is the drawings of the second courtyard, a bit jumbled up there. You can see the well here. I don't think I've shown you this one later, but this is my tracing of it, and we'll look at them in individual. This is the rear of House 2 now in Shearman, and here we see Rothe's House, Colm Market, Kilkenny, 1852. Now what's extraordinary here is we get confirmation that there's very little here. There's no built volume, and also that there's a chimney here. And we've got beguiling windows looking from gables here. Again, open to interpretation. In other words, I haven't a clue. And this is the most excellent drawing that Phelim Manning did of House 2 these days. I think it's 2001, annotated and augmented by Ben Murtaugh's analysis of the fabric. And Ben was clearly noticing something that most of us wouldn't pick up on with the naked eye. This break here, but he's dead right. That's new build. I mean, it's also reasonably obvious there's brick in the arches of the windows in this location. But he's corroborating what Shearman has drawn positively, identifying the fabric that was subsequently added to Rothe House by Timothy O'Hanlon, and we'll move on to him. Very beautiful drawing, extremely important. There's a set of these drawings that Phelim has done that I think should be published at some point. They're really wonderful, a wonderful record of the building, stone accurate. And here we have House 2 as it was in 2006 or 7 or so, when I was happily working in this building in the Heritage Council. So that's the reality of it. The outscale is drawn like this by Shearman, roof over part of it, a couple of doors missing here, and a window instead of a door down here. I don't know if we can be certain that that means that they weren't there, or that his record making was sketchy. A strange side note, we talk in this company about the Outscale as if everyone knew what an Outscale was. I took the effort to look it up in the Oxford English Dictionary. It's not there. And if you Google it, you'll only ever get brought back to something to do with Rothe House. The word comes from John Rothe's will, and it may be a particular name, and we maybe should be sending it into the Oxford English Dictionary to assert that it is an important word, at least around these parts. So when we talk about an Outscale, nobody else will understand what we're talking about, just so you know. And this is the reality that you can see when you walk out the door this evening. An extra set of openings that aren't in Shearman's drawing, I don't know why, and some medieval fabric. And certainly the stonework around these doors has all the appearance of being medieval in terms of the tooling on it. We have allegations and theories that stonework was taken from elsewhere around the city and placed here. This may be an instance of that, who knows. And then House 3, and I'm beginning House 3's description with Coughlin's survey of it in around 1989, Colm Murray, and really not an awful lot left. We look then at what Shearman saw. Again, no big gable there now. The Outscale shown in diagrammatic form here. These two arches, I think, are both referred to in Banham's description of the building in the novels. And again, it's up to anyone to try and interpret how the artist was looking at the roof in this case. We have big gables, they're documented as existing all that time. Was he trying to show that in this drawing? This is the House 3 after the 1990 reconstruction, so quite dramatically changed, I'd have to say, in comparison to the original fabric. And we have one last drawing, which is the rear of House 3, and it's very confused, I have to say, but we do know that there was a large, probably former staircase just here. The foundations of it were found in archaeological excavation. It's drawn in the Valuations Office, it's measured in the Valuations Office, and there's some attempt to depict something here in relation to that. Sorry, it's tentative. We'll all be familiar with this image, the Lawrence Collection photograph of Rothe House. And it does contain some important information, not least about the condition of the building. We see steps down, up, level here, up, and I think Jason Bolton, who looked at this photograph really carefully, thinks he saw darkness in there that indicated that there were steps down. Actually, the map that I showed you shows 5 sets of steps across the front of Rothe House. Five sets of steps. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And again, you may know where I'm going with this, but I'll be bringing that all together later. The man who saved Rothe House first time around, Timothy O'Hanrahan. I'm not sure if anyone has ever actually published what that plaque says. It has been published. I made a stab at it myself, so I'll be corrected on this. I think he's saying, direct your prayers for Timothy O'Hanrahan, whether you are alive or dead. He renovated and extended this house in the year of the age of Christ, 1898, I think. He's asking you to pray for him because he repaired Rothe House. Why would he do that? I'm going to quote you a little bit of ecological philosophy that I find fascinating. It's a woman called Laurie Gruen. She's talking about science and the struggle to get heard and all of that. But she says, facts are theory-laden, theories are value-laden, and values are moulded by historical and philosophical ideologies, social norms, and individual processes of categorization. Okay, what does that mean? Here you have a guy who's a whole load of thoughts in his head. He's in the Gaelic League, he's a successful businessman, he's a solicitor, got money in his pocket, and he's hanging around in a time when Ireland is bursting for independence, and he sees this remnant of pre-colonial times, John Rothe's time, and it's in abject poverty. There are reports coming in all the time about the piles of pig manure, and so on in Rothe House. I put this picture beside it. I'm not sure of its date, and I hesitate to suggest that it is prior to the reconstruction, but just to remember that people with no shoes lived here. And he took that and erased the memory of poverty by his actions, I think almost deliberately, and restored the building to some dignity, to a prior state that represented a more noble Irish past. So that's why I'm quoting Laurie Gruen. The ideas in his head changed the way this building is. That's my theory. So this is what it looks like in 1950. We have a sort of an oriel window. We have some prim and proper plaster and render and place in use and so on. And then I'm not going to talk about the 1960s transformation, which was substantial in its own right and informed by the ideas, I believe, that were in Percy the Clerk's head about what a medieval building ought to look like. But I'm going to jump to this central image of Rothe House, the one that was used in the logo for the Rothe House Trust. This building with an arcaded base. And just to remember what an extraordinary thing that was. Built in 1594. The city was besieged a few years later by brothers of the Earl of Ormond rebelling against the English, unhappy with the way things were. There was soldiers outside the rear wall, and yet in sharp contrast to tower houses built in the countryside, built inside town walls, we have this open architecture of arcading. And Kilkenny was noted for having many examples of this at this time and into the next years of the 17th century. And I think this deserves to be explored or understood. We have commentators talking about open walkways that you can pass from building to building under. And yet, in its detail, before I jump onto that, I've got one more slide to show you, which is a kind of a summary of what we know about Rothe House in the 17th century from two documentary sources. John Rothe's will, written in 1619, and the Civil Survey, written in 1654, I think, and purporting to describe the city just before it fell to Cromwell. What have I got here? The black lettering describes how John Rothe described his own house, and the red lettering is the Civil Survey description, and they accord to our mute masonry remains reasonably well. I think the most important things that I would point out, well, my 4 Street gate, we'll be looking at that a little more. Ye 4 Street building of my said house, so this is the 4 Street building, that's what he called it. And then we can only surmise that this is the Middler Cross House, and the close under the said cross house, that has to be here. And the pinion or cross wall next to my own bed chamber, I think that's this wall. And then the kitchen at the east end of the Outscale or building next to my said bed chamber. So that puts a kitchen here, and John Rothe's bed chamber here. And from what we've seen of the volumetries some centuries later, we could surmise that this is a single story building. And again, I'm going to take a leap of imagination of John Rothe having been burnt out of whatever house he lived in previously in one of the fires that happened in Kilkenny at the end of the 16th century, that he was petrified of finding himself on an upper floor of a building that was on fire. It's just a picture. But right next door to that bedchamber, I'm then proposing that his wife had her kitchen with a very big fire in it that would have been on all the time. So, but I think those two things do go together. We find an arch in the men's toilets that is as substantial, not quite as substantial as this arch, but certainly as substantial as the arch in the second house. And it may well have been a fireplace arch. I think this is proof that it was. The careful reading of the will. And then an outhouse fit for laying of corn, and a new house or building next to my garden, a great kitchen and guile house, the Ye Kill, the kiln in the said outbuildings. This is the third house is clearly more of an industrial or purposeful nature to it, and we see this huge big opening here, and archaeological investigations in the 1990s in this area here revealed drains, and there's a sink and stone upstairs on the top floor, I think, as well. So there's no real doubt that this is the place where you made beer. Okay, so that's what we know about the 17th century. So let's get back to the arcade now. It's not mentioned in the will, okay? But the cellar is. Cellar underneath it is mentioned. Rosa Archer has a stairs in the 4th Street gate that goes down to the cellar that she is allowed to access. How could this possibly have worked with all these steps? I'm going to reveal one last document from the 5th of December 1848, height of the famine, Committee for the Relief of Distress. They make a note to have the entrance to Wolf's Arch so regulated as to admit a car. Could it possibly have been to get bodies in and out? Could it have just been to let the muck flow out onto the street? I don't know. But when you're leaving this evening and you're going through the gate in Rothe House, have a look left and right at the masonry on either side, and I think you'll notice this significant difference between the one and the other. And I think there's a couple of knocks off the stone here as well. And I think this is the actual work that was carried out as a result of this resolution of the Committee for the Relief of Distress. So they said that on the 5th of December 1848, and then 3 months later, no, January, February, 2 months later, is when Graves is writing in the Kilkenny Moderator about these new arches that have appeared in the front of Rothe House. So you could say that the discovery of Rothe House as a medieval remain is perhaps a direct result of an attempt to relieve distress in relation to one of the worst tenements in Kilkenny in the 1840s. Anyone inclined to nod their head or shake it? I think that's proven. I think that's what happened. So when we look at this, we're actually looking at a newly completed work, and the level has been lowered from here down to here. A smooth pathway or a ramp to admit or to let a cart get into the courtyards of Rothe House has just been done. Now, I wonder, is this telling us something else about Rothe House? If you remember, the first description I gave you of Rothe House was in the first photograph of the courtyard. There's wonderful recession and depth in the buildings. It's so easy to catch a glimpse of this doorway, and Graves had to fake it to show it in this particular sketch that he made. But I wonder, was John Rothe's treasure house, where his wonderful imported cloths and luxury goods were held for people to finger and buy, well within the complex in a protected place behind his 4th Street gate in the second house at the ground floor level, with a door that you could see from the street, with a hood moulding over it, my proposal. And it leads on to a whole load of other questions that aren't answered. There's a set of analyses of medieval castles and medieval buildings done in Britain and begun in Ireland with the work of an archaeologist called Rory Sherlock, who talks about access analysis. So if you have a fortified place, a castle, how many gates or doors you need to get through to get to a secure place or a place of privilege or power like the battlements is an important matter, and you can count the doors, and that can tell you something about how secure or private a place is. Now, I put this drawing together. Again, the base map is one of Phelan and Ben's drawings, and I just started counting out the number of original doors, or purportedly original doors, that there are around Rothe House. So let's start with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 for each of the arches, down to basements perhaps, maybe not. We have the remains of a door in this wall, on and on and on and on it goes, to 23, a door beside the fireplace in the Cronin room, and 24 if you count the recess at the top of the stairs when you come up from the shop, as it used to be. Maybe. Could have been put in later, who knows. But that's a very porous building, isn't it? That's a lot of ways in particular, the archway in what is now the stairs here to the side. It's a fancy arch, and it's the widest one. It would in its day have admitted a car, perhaps. It may have been the place where luxury goods or the imports that John Rothe was involved in came into the plot. But it tells us a whole series of other things about the city around it, that it wasn't divided up the way we think of cities being divided up. And again, I'm including stairs here to get up to the hall, because the stairs in its own right is a form of lack of accessibility, shall I put it that way. Look also at the number of openings in the second passageway. There's the hanging stones for a substantial gate just inside this arch here. There are two beautiful stone doors here, and there's another blocked up entrance here with a hood moulding over it. You'll see them all as you leave. And of course the arched doorway here that I mentioned first, which is visible from the street. So I wonder, is this the place where you would keep your precious goods in Rothe House? And you'd let the other two to day-to-day traders, cabbages, potatoes, less valuable things. So some of those questions are posed in this section. This drawing is here because I'm an architect, and we cut through buildings and do drawings of it, and I want to insist on having one. But this was drawn in the 1960s by the OPW architects, and it posed a few questions and contains a few pieces of evidence. It's also important from that point of view. A stone gutter proves the levels of the roof in House 2 were raised. We saw it as a two-storey house in the 1850s. Here it is after Timothy O'Hanlon had worked it. And original stone gutter here. And then there's some questions about the floor levels in the Phelan room and the Lanigan room. And I'm not sure the evidence is there to suggest that things changed dramatically. But, and then finally, it cuts a section through the cellars, the lower area. And we all know how low those rooms are now because of the floor level inside, certainly in the reception area being at the level of the street. There's very little space below it. So if this was to be a cellar that people lived in the 1840s, it surely had a higher roof. And I think that that is true because of the way it was divided in the 1840s, that it was through all 5 bays of the building. And therefore we see the passageway as having been lowered just before Graves made his sketch. Some photographs from the 1960s works before restoration. Sadly, I have a fear that these are the photographs of the 17th century roof before it was taken down. We can't say how structurally sound that roof was, we don't know, but I have the feeling that these are the last remnants of the timber to support the oak partitions that Graves described in the 1850s. And again, the fireplaces and those windows in the gables. Nearly finished now, so stay awake. So we have this transformation here, and this is a report that Colleen did for us in 2014. We looked specifically and critically at the fireplaces, and Colleen was quite sceptical about them, and I hope that his scepticism that this particular fireplace was placed there in the 1960s, I hope it's based on his presumption that these struts were there to construct something, but I hope also that they were there to stop something from moving during a period of construction. We put braces in openings to prevent them from moving. And if so, it is in fact in its original position. The fireplaces, the windows, the mute masonry walls, these are the evidence that we have left to us. And I don't think we have really tried hard to put them together in our minds, in our mentalities, into a picture of how the space was and what it could possibly have been used for back in the 17th century. So we have a bravura performance of a medieval roof above the Lanigan room, a wonderful thing, but it is not the original, unfortunately. And we have these two eyes on either side of the chimney that are asking us questions. I've got some plans here, but I think I'm going to skip through them and look at this photograph of the Phelan room. So we have a stairs that is Percy Leclerc's view of what medieval stairs ought to look like, and we know that because it's in several other buildings, like the Ormond Castle in Carrickfergus, Parks Castle in County Leitrim, and others. But never mind that. I want you to remember or think about these three openings here. You can only see two, but there's a third behind the stairs. What are these windows doing? Here's the window out onto the street. This is at first floor level. It could only have been a tiny building that was beside that. Here's Phelan's drawing of the Phelan room. It's not square. It's interesting, he's the first person to show precisely how not square it is. And I wonder if this was where you came into that room or set of rooms when it was built first. And I wonder, and this is open questions again, if we can overlay this very standard medieval pattern of space on the first floor plan of Rothe House, of what's called a screens passage that you enter into before entering into a larger room, with small rooms for serving and for keeping the drinks and the food to its minor side, with these windows lighting them, and then a hall which has got the biggest fireplace in the house in it, and beyond that a chamber with the next biggest fireplace, also important and beautiful and symbolic in its own right. Now, I'm just putting those words on a piece of paper because if, like a proper architect, I was to propose where the walls were, I'd start running into all sorts of problems of crashing into windows and spaces not being big enough. So I'll just have to leave it at a tentative proposition that we could perhaps map a very archetypal medieval plan of how a building was used onto the room that is surviving here in Rothe House. And this is comparing, and you'll see this now, this my assertion that John Rothe's bedchamber is what we now call the kitchen with the spiral staircase in it. We're proposing to put a lift in it. Maybe that wasn't a good idea. And that this is Rosa Archer's kitchen here. And is it possible that this magnificent fireplace in the Cronin room either heated an office or warehouse or showroom, or was it perhaps used for cooking as well? Telling stories, that's maybe a way of thinking about history. I won't go into that. So this is the way we find Rothe House now. But I'm going to show you another image that perhaps shows how these buildings appeared in Kilkenny at the time. Quoting and paraphrasing Terence Reeves Smith, who was writing about 17th century country buildings. But he said, buildings were intended to impose from a distance across roofs, hills and tree tops, and to be seen from a variety of different angles. The architectural emphasis was focused less on elaborate front facades and more on roof forms and on exploiting a building's three-dimensional aspect. So these gable walls, this is the She House I'm writing it on further up High Street. And it has these windows that clearly had to be looking out over the rooftops of minor buildings. And they happen on both gables of Rothe House. So we get a picture of Rothe's house standing way above everything else around it, and looking out in practically all directions, or getting light from all directions, and intending to be seen as this monumental and significant and huge mansion that displayed his wealth. And don't forget that the plot that we're on is 3 times the normal width of a medieval Burgage plot. So this was extravagance. And I think this is my last slide, and I'm taking you somewhere else, to Carrickfergus in County Antrim. One of several drawings of aerial perspectives of Carrickfergus. And I just want to point out that there are 4 different types of house in this drawing, 4 different places where people could live. There's the castle, which is, monumental and military and defensive and big thick walls and so on. There are these tower houses, and there are tiny diminutive buildings in between, and you can see windows peeking out, looking sideways over the tops of buildings. And then these structures here, which are clearly for the poorest people. But just to remember that here in Kilkenny we have a castle, we have buildings like Rothe House, they're not tower houses, and there must have been minor buildings to their sides, like in Carrickfergus, and perhaps there were other buildings where the landless lived in the vicinity of the town, barely tolerated over time. So I'll leave you with that picture, and thank you very much for listening.